Jedediah Kane and 20 armed riders weren't at his gate for him. They were there for his horses. "We have a writ of seizure for the painted horse herd, Cole," Kane's voice boomed, a smirk playing on his lips. Elijah looked past him, at the magnificent animals huddled in his corral, then at the terrified faces of the woman and children in his cabin. He had been a ghost for a decade, a man with nothing to lose. He had been wrong. How had a business proposition made only a week ago brought a private army to his door? If you are curious what happens next, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss this incredible story. It all began a week ago with the subtle shift in the wind that signaled the end of a long, brutal summer. For 10 years, Elijah Cole had been a man in conversation only with the elements. His ranch, a solitary outpost tucked into Wyoming's Echo Canyon, was a world meticulously crafted to keep the past at bay. He was a ghost in the landscape of his own life, his days measured by the rising of the sun and the slow, relentless ache in his chest. A flash flood in '78 had been the architect of his solitude, a roaring wall of brown water and splintered timber that had stolen his wife, Clara, and their 5-year-old son, Thomas, leaving Elijah the sole survivor of a world that had ceased to exist. He had rebuilt the cabin on the same ground, a stubborn act of penance, and had cultivated his silence as a shield. A heart that is never offered, he reasoned, can never be taken again. His solitude was not peace, it was a carefully guarded scar. The canyon was a place of stark, unforgiving beauty, its high walls amplifying the sound of the wind, making it seem as though the mountains themselves were whispering of old sorrows. The nearby town of Fort Prosperity was a bitter irony, a settlement whose prosperity was built on the slow, systemic strangulation of the Shoshone, the people who had called this land home for centuries. The town's unchallenged ruler was Jedediah Kane, a man who owned the bank, the general store, and the souls of most of the men who lived there. Kane saw the world not in terms of people, but of assets, and the most valuable asset in the entire territory was water. Elijah's ranch, blessed with the only year-round, spring-fed creek in the basin, was an intolerable anomaly in Kane's ledger, a defiant island of independence in the land baron's ever-expanding empire. Elijah's refusal to sell, his quiet self-sufficiency, and his failure to join the town's chorus of anti-Shoshone rhetoric had made him Kane's primary obsession, a loose thread in the man's perfectly woven tapestry of control. On that fateful morning a week ago, Elijah had been riding his northern fence line, the air still and heavy with the promise of change. There were signs of trouble everywhere, for those who knew how to read them. The game was scarce, driven out by Kane's hired hunters. The river that snaked through the valley below was running low, a direct result of the new dam Kane had built upstream, a project that was slowly starving the land and the Shoshone people who depended on it. As Elijah paused at the spring, the very source of Kane's envy, he noticed a disturbance in the dust to the west, a large cloud, moving slowly and deliberately. It was not a storm, it was a herd. As he watched from the cover of a rocky outcrop, he saw them. It was a magnificent herd of horses, at least 200 strong, their coats a dazzling array of colors: pintos, Appaloosas, deep roans, the legendary painted horses of the Shoshone, a herd that was said to be the very soul of the tribe. They were not raiding. They were moving with a desperate, weary slowness, driven by a small group of riders. He saw women and children among them. This was not a war party. It was a migration, a flight. They were being pushed from their ancestral lands by Kane's manufactured drought, their own water sources having run dry. They were heading directly for his spring, the only source of life-giving water for miles. He watched them approach, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He knew this was the moment he had been dreading for a decade. The outside world, with all its greed, its prejudice, and its suffering, was about to break down his door. He was a ghost who had just been seen, a silent man who was about to be forced to speak. The herd and the desperate family with them were a turning point, a fateful decision marching directly toward him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his quiet, lonely world was about to be set on fire. He remained hidden as they approached, his old Winchester resting in the crook of his arm, a cold and useless comfort. The herd, driven by a primal thirst, surged toward the spring, their hooves churning the earth into a chaotic symphony. The riders, 3 women and 2 young boys guided them with a practiced, weary skill. One woman dismounted, her movements imbued with a quiet, regal authority. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps no more than 30, but her face was etched with the lines of a grief and a responsibility that were ancient. She walked to the edge of the spring, not to drink, but to kneel, placing her palm on the damp earth in a gesture of profound, prayerful respect. She was not a thief stealing his water. She was a supplicant asking for a blessing. As she rose, her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept across the landscape and settled directly on the rocky outcrop where he was hiding. She had known he was there all along. She did not call out or make a sign of aggression. She simply stood, her gaze holding his, a silent acknowledgement across the space that separated them. In her eyes, he saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a reflection of his own profound weariness, the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. After a long moment, she turned and spoke to the others. Slowly, deliberately, they began to make a small, temporary camp, a clear statement that they were not just passing through. They were here, on his land. A wave of cold, hard reason washed over Elijah. To let them stay was to declare war on Jedediah Kane. Kane would see this not as an act of mercy, but as a conspiracy, a direct alliance with the people he was trying to crush. He would use the full force of his bought and paid for legal system to ruin him, to seize the land and the water he coveted. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to ride down there, fire a shot into the air, and drive them off. It was his land, his water. He had every right. Survival demanded it, but his feet felt as if they had taken root in the rocky soil. He looked at the woman, at the 2 young boys whose faces were masks of exhaustion and fear, and at the other women, one of whom was heavy with child. He saw not a threat, but a family, a small, desperate band of survivors pushed to the brink by a cruelty they did not deserve. He saw his own wife, Clara, in the proud, determined set of the woman's jaw. He saw his own son, Thomas, in the wide, terrified eyes of the 2 boys. The ghosts he had spent a decade trying to bury were suddenly standing before him, living and breathing, their silent accusation more powerful than any armed threat. To drive them away, to deny them the very water that gave his own life meaning, would be to commit a sin against their memory. It would be to become a man like Cain, a man whose heart was as dry and barren as the land he was trying to create. The fortress of his solitude, which he had built to protect himself from pain, suddenly felt like a prison of selfishness. The decision was not a choice, but a surrender. A surrender to the man he had been before the flood, a man who believed in kindness, a man who had a heart capable of breaking. He left his rifle leaning against the rocks, a silent treaty. He walked slowly, openly, down the slope toward their camp. The boys scrambled behind their mothers, their hands reaching for bows, but the lead woman held up a hand, stopping them. She watched him approach, her expression unreadable. He did not speak. He walked past them, to his own spring, the heart of his land, and gestured to it with an open palm. "It is yours," the gesture said. "Drink." He then pointed to the rich grazing land in the basin below, the best pasture on his property. "Rest here." It was an unconditional offer, an act of trust so absolute it defied all logic. He was not just offering them a drink. He was offering them a sanctuary. He was offering them everything he had. If you believe Elijah made the right choice, to risk everything for what is right, please like this video to spread the kindness. The woman, whose name was Amina, which meant faithful in her tongue, accepted his offer with a quiet, dignified nod that conveyed more gratitude than 1,000 words could have. For 3 days, a strange and fragile peace settled over Echo Canyon. A silent, respectful boundary was drawn between his cabin and their camp by the spring. Elijah went about his usual chores, acutely aware of the new, vibrant life that now occupied his periphery. He would catch glimpses of the boys, no older than 10, practicing with their bows, their serious faces a heartbreaking testament to a childhood stolen by hardship. He saw the women tending to the magnificent herd, their movements a beautiful, ancient dance of care and reverence for the animals that were the very soul of their people. He felt like a ghost in his own home, a silent observer of a life that was so profoundly different, yet so fundamentally the same as the one he had lost. It was a beautiful, aching pain, a reminder of the family he no longer had. On the fourth day, the outside world arrived. It was Jedediah Kane's foreman, a hard, cruel man named Barlow, accompanied by two of Kane's hired guns. They didn't ride to his cabin, but to the edge of the basin, their presence a deliberate, menacing intrusion. Barlow sat on his horse, a sneer on his face, as he surveyed the painted horse herd grazing peacefully on Elijah's land. "Quite a collection you've got there, Cole," Barlow called out, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Kane's been looking to acquire some new breeding stock. He'd be willing to make you a generous offer for the whole lot." The offer was a trap, and they both knew it. The horses were not his to sell. Barlow was testing him, trying to force him to declare his allegiance. "They're not for sale," Elijah said, his voice flat, his gaze steady. Barlow's sneer widened. "Everything has a price," he said, before wheeling his horse around and riding off, his silent message having been delivered. The encounter left a poisonous residue in the air, a promise of violence to come. That evening, Amina approached his cabin for the first time. She did not come to thank him. She came with a business proposition. She spoke a halting but clear English, her voice soft but imbued with an iron will. She explained that her husband, the chief's son, had been killed in a skirmish with the Kiowa, a conflict secretly instigated by Kane's men. Her father-in-law, the old chief, had died of a broken heart soon after, leaving the tribe fractured and leaderless. A rival, a warrior named Coman, who believed the only path forward was through total war, was now vying for control. He saw her and her magnificent herd, a symbol of the old, peaceful ways, as a threat to his power. She was not just fleeing a drought. She was fleeing a civil war, a battle for the very soul of her people. She then made her offer, the one that would seal his fate. "My people are scattered," she said, her eyes meeting his, a silent plea for understanding. "They have nothing. This herd is all we have left. It is our future, but we cannot protect it." She gestured to the vast, open plains. "Out there, Kane's men will steal them, or Coman's warriors will seize them for his war. We need a sanctuary, a place to keep them safe until I can reunite my people." Then she laid her terms on the table. "In return for shelter," she said, her voice steady and proud, "for you, and for my family, until the first snow, I will give you 20 of my finest mares and 2 breeding stallions. They will be yours. A new herd for the man who has none." It was an offer of astonishing generosity, a chance to rebuild the life he had lost. But it was also a trap. To accept her offer was to formally bind his fate to hers, to become the official guardian of the Shoshone's most sacred asset, and in doing so, to paint a target squarely on his own back for both Kane and the vengeful warrior, Coman, to see. Elijah looked at Amina, at the proud, desperate hope in her eyes, and he knew he had no choice. His life had already been bound to hers the moment he had walked down from that ridge. To refuse her now would be a cowardly retreat, a betrayal of the flicker of life she had reawakened in him. "I accept," he said, the 2 words a quiet oath that sealed his fate. The deal was struck not with a handshake, but with a long, silent look of mutual understanding. He was no longer just a man offering water. He was a partner, a guardian of a legacy. The fragile peace of the past few days was over, replaced by the heavy, ominous weight of a formal alliance. He had chosen his side. He had a family to protect, and a herd that represented the future of an entire people. The ghost of Echo Canyon had just been given a reason to fight. The inevitable confrontation came a week later, not with a war party, but with the cold, sterile violence of the law. Jedediah Kane, flanked by the town sheriff and a dozen armed deputies, rode up to his gate, not with an offer, but with an official-looking document. "Elijah Cole," Kane said, his voice ringing with a false, theatrical authority. "I have here a writ of seizure, signed by the territorial judge. The Shoshone assets, including the painted horse herd, have been declared forfeit as payment for outstanding debts and reparations owed to the good people of Fort Prosperity." It was a lie, a complete fabrication, a legal document purchased with Kane's gold and the town's prejudice. It was theft, sanctified by a corrupt system. Kane's eyes glittered with triumph. He had him. He had found a way to take not just the water, but the horses, the land, everything. "This is my land," Elijah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, his hand inching toward the shotgun he held. "And these horses are my property. A business transaction." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your property? A backwoods transaction with a savage? That won't stand up in any court, Cole. The horses are collateral for the tribe's debt. We are simply collecting." He gestured to his men, who began to dismount, ready to force their way to the corral. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake ready to strike. It was a dozen armed men against one. A hopeless fight. But as Elijah cocked the hammer of his shotgun, a new voice, clear and strong, cut through the air. "He is not the one who owes you a debt." Amina stepped out onto the porch, her two young sons flanking her like stoic little guards. Her face was a mask of cold, regal fury. She held up a worn, leather-bound ledger. "My husband kept records," she said, her eyes locked on Kane. "Records of every trade, every promise, every loan you made to our people. He also kept records of your crimes." Her voice did not waver as she began to read from the book. She spoke of Kane selling tainted flour that sickened their children, of him trading rifles to the Kiowa to instigate the very conflict that had killed her husband, of him systematically diverting water not just from her people, but from the smaller, independent ranches in the valley, ranches he later bought for pennies on the dollar when they went bankrupt. She was not just defending a herd. She was exposing an empire, dismantling Kane's carefully constructed reputation as a town father, revealing him for the predator he was. The deputies, men from those very ranches, began to look at each other, then at Kane, their loyalty visibly wavering. The foundation of Kane's power crumbling under the weight of a dead man's words, spoken by a woman he had never imagined would have a voice. If you were one of the deputies, hearing this truth for the first time, what would you do? Write your thoughts in the comments below. The air crackled with a tension thicker than dust. The deputies, men who had signed on for what they thought was a legal seizure, now stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of two competing truths. On one side was Jedediah Kane, the source of their paychecks, a man whose power had seemed as absolute as the mountains. On the other was a Shoshone widow, armed with nothing but a leather book and a voice that rang with an undeniable, gut-wrenching authenticity. She wasn't just speaking of crimes against her people. She was speaking of their families, their foreclosed ranches, their children's sicknesses. She was giving a name to the quiet, creeping ruin that had befallen the entire valley, and that name was Jedediah Kane. The sheriff, a man whose loyalty was bought but whose conscience was not entirely dead, looked at the pale, trembling rage on Kane's face and then at the stoic, righteous fury on Amina's. And for the first time, he began to doubt the simple, profitable narrative he had been fed. Kane, seeing his authority dissolving before his very eyes, made a fatal mistake. He let his mask of civility slip, revealing the snarling predator beneath. "Lies," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. The ravings of a bitter squaw. "Seize the horses." But his men did not move. They hesitated, a mutinous stillness that was more damning than any open rebellion. In that moment of hesitation, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. It was no longer about a legal writ. It was about a moral reckoning. Amina had not just presented evidence. She had held up a mirror, and in it, the men of the posse saw their own complicity, their own foolishness in trusting a man who had been slowly poisoning them all along. It was Elijah who spoke next, his voice calm and resolute, the voice of a man who had nothing left to fear. "There will be no seizure today," he said, his shotgun still held at a non-threatening angle, but his eyes promising a violence he had held in check for a decade. "This woman and her family are under my protection. These horses are on my land. Any man who steps through that gate will be trespassing." He was no longer a ghost. He was a landowner, a guardian, a man of property and principle, speaking a language the deputies understood far better than Kane's blustering rage. He was offering them a choice, a chance to align themselves not with a tyrant, but with a neighbor, with a man who was standing for a justice they now realized was their own. One by one, the deputies slowly, deliberately, began to remount their horses, their faces grim, their loyalties silently, irrevocably shifting. Then, from the west, a new sound, the thunder of hoofbeats. But this was not the cavalry. It was a war party, at least 50 strong, their painted faces a terrifying vision of primal fury. At their head was Coman, the rival warrior, his eyes burning with a fanatical zeal. He had come not for Kane, but for the herd, the symbol of the old ways he sought to destroy. Kane's face lit up with a look of demonic glee. He had lost his posse, but the universe had just handed him a new, far more destructive weapon. "See," he screamed at the retreating deputies. "I told you, they're savages. They're here to kill us all." But Amina was not afraid. She turned to Elijah, her eyes not with terror, but with a fierce, desperate plea. "He will not listen to me," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "But he might listen to you." She was not asking him to fight. She was asking him to do the impossible, to stand in the middle of a battlefield between two warring factions and be a bridge. It was the ultimate moral challenge, a test of a trust that had been forged only a week ago, a journey into the heart of a fire from which there might be no escape. Elijah looked from the approaching dust cloud of Coleman's war party to the pale, wavering faces of the deputies, and then to the smug, triumphant sneer on Kane's face. He was standing on a powder keg, and two separate fires were racing toward it. His entire life, his entire world, had been reduced to this single, impossible moment in the dust in front of his gate. He looked at Amina, at the absolute, unwavering faith in her eyes. She believed he could do this. She believed this quiet, broken man had the strength to stand between two armies. And in that moment, he chose to believe it too. He handed his shotgun to her. "Get the children inside and bar the door," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't possessed in over a decade. He then turned and walked, alone and unarmed, into the open space between his ranch and the approaching warriors, a solitary, defiant figure ready to meet the storm. Coleman and his warriors reined in their horses, their momentum halted by the sheer, unexpected audacity of the lone man standing in their path. Coleman, a man whose face was a mask of brutal ambition, stared down at Elijah, his hand gripping a war lance. "This is not your fight, white man," he snarled. "Give us the herd and the woman, and we will let you live." From behind, Kane screamed, "He's with them, Coleman. He's their ally. Kill him, and the horses are yours." Kane was trying to fan the flames, to ignite the final, explosive conflict that would solve all his problems. But Elijah ignored them both. He spoke, his voice calm and steady, not to the warrior, but to the man. "The woman you speak of is a chief's widow," he said, his voice carrying with a surprising power. "The herd you see is the future of your children, and the man who is screaming behind me is the one who killed her husband." The accusation, so direct and so unexpected, struck Coleman with the force of a physical blow. He stared at Elijah, then turned his furious gaze toward Kane, who was now sputtering, his face pale with shock. "This is Shoshone business," Coleman growled, turning back to Elijah, but his certainty was shaken. It was at that moment that the deputies, who had been retreating, made a choice. The sheriff, his face set with a new, grim resolve, trotted his horse forward to stand beside Elijah, his own rifle now held across his lap. "What this woman said about Kane," the sheriff said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "About the bad flower, about the ranches, we believe her." One by one, the other deputies moved their horses, forming a loose, protective line alongside Elijah, their guns not aimed at the Shoshone, but pointedly, damningly, in the direction of Jedediah Kane. The battlefield had just been redrawn. It was no longer settler versus Shoshone. It was everyone versus Kane. The sight of his own hired law turning against him was the final straw. Kane, his empire of lies and intimidation crumbling around him, let out a scream of pure, impotent rage. He pulled his pistol and fired a wild shot, not at Elijah or Coleman, but at the corral, a desperate, spiteful act to scatter the herd and destroy the prize he could not have. But before the chaos could erupt, an arrow, swift and silent as a whisper, flew from the porch of the cabin. It struck Kane squarely in the wrist, causing him to drop his pistol with a cry of pain. Amina stood there, a bow in her hand, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury, a protector of her family, her herd, and her home. The confrontation was over. Coleman, seeing the truth of the situation laid bare, looked from the wounded, pathetic figure of Kane to the strange, powerful alliance before him, a reclusive rancher, a widow, and a town sheriff. and he did the one thing his warrior pride should have forbidden. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod of respect to Elijah, then turned his war party around and led them away. The war for the soul of the Shoshone would be settled another day, but not here, not like this. A bridge had been built, not with words, but with a shared, courageous stand against a common evil. The door had been opened. If you believe that courage is standing together, even with your enemies, to fight for what is right, please share this video. 10 years later, Echo Canyon was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of a thriving ranch and the laughter of children. The painted horse herd, magnificent and larger than ever, grazed peacefully in the basin, a living testament to a promise kept. Elijah Cole was no longer a ghost. He was a patriarch, a respected elder whose quiet wisdom was sought not just by the townsfolk of a reformed Fort Prosperity, but by the leaders of a reunified Shoshone nation. The flood of 78 had taken his first family, a wound that never truly disappeared, but the drought of 88 had, in a miraculous turn of fate, brought him a new one. He had married Amina 2 years after their standoff at the gate, a union born not of passion, but of a deep, abiding respect and a shared history forged in the crucible of conflict. They had raised her 2 sons as their own and had been blessed with a daughter, a little girl with her mother's fierce eyes and her father's quiet, gentle soul, whom they named Clara. The ledger that Amina had used to dismantle Jedediah Kane's empire became a legendary artifact. It was kept in a glass case in the new town hall, a permanent reminder of the day a corrupt tyrant was brought down not by guns, but by the truth, spoken by a woman who refused to be silenced. Kane, abandoned by his men and disgraced, had been arrested by the very sheriff he once owned. He died in a territorial prison, a forgotten man, his name a byword for greed and hubris. The Shoshone, united under a new, wise chief who had been one of Amina's staunchest supporters, had negotiated a new, fairer treaty with the territorial government, using Kane's crimes as leverage. They had secured rights to the very water he had tried to steal from them, and the painted horse herd was now a symbol not of a scattered past, but of a proud, resilient future. Elijah's ranch became a true sanctuary, a bridge between the two worlds. The children, his sons and his daughter, grew up with the best of both. They learned to read Shakespeare from their father and to read the soul of the land from their mother. They spoke both English and Shoshone, moving between the worlds with an easy grace that was a source of constant wonder to Elijah. He had not just been given a new family. He had become the patriarch of a new kind of people, a generation that was not defined by the divisions of the past, but by the shared promise of a more hopeful future. The old, painful silence of his grief had been replaced by the rich, vibrant sounds of a life he had never imagined possible, a life filled with the small, sacred moments that make a world whole. The smell of his wife's cooking, the sound of his son's laughter, the warmth of his daughter's hand in his. Their story became the founding myth of the new era in the valley, a tale told by settlers and Shoshone alike. It was a story of how a reclusive rancher, a grieving widow, and a town sheriff, men and women who should have been enemies, had stood together against a common evil and, in doing so, had created a new and better world. It was proof that family is not always a matter of blood, but of the alliances you forge in the face of injustice. It was a testament to the idea that a community is not defined by the walls it builds to keep others out, but by the bridges it builds to bring them together. Looking back, we are left to ask what a home truly is. For 10 years, Elijah had believed his home was a fortress, a place to hide from the pain of the world. But Amina had taught him a more profound truth. A home is not a place you hide in, it is a place you stand for. It is not a shield to protect you from the world, but a foundation from which you can change it. The Shoshone widow who appeared at his spring had not just offered him a herd. She had offered him a kingdom, a family, and a reason to live again. She had offered him a home, not of wood and stone, but of courage, love, and a shared, unbreakable hope. If you believe that our true purpose is found not in hiding from the world, but in building a better one, subscribe to Mr. Storytelling, where every story is a search for a place to truly call home.